multiple presidents, including President Trump, when he was in office, said that they wouldn't allow Iran to become a nuclear power. He may now have to put up or shut up when it comes to that. Welcome to Shielded the Republic, a podcast sponsored by the Bulwark and the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia. I'm Eric Edelman, counselor at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, a non-resident fellow at the Miller Center, and a Bulwark contributor. And I'm joined, as always, by my colleague in all things strategy, grand and less grand, Eliot Cohen, the Arleigh Burke Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and Professor of Strategic Studies Emeritus at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Eliot, welcome back. How were your holidays, and how was your sojourn in Gay Paris?
Well, first I'll do Paris. I was there with Phil O'Brien, who we've spoken with before, to talk about our report on the analysis of the Russian and Ukrainian militaries before the war. And that was a lot of fun. We did that at IFRI, the major French think tank, co-sponsored with our friends at the FRS, which is another think tank. But the fun part, which you missed, was having dinner with some of our old colleagues from the days when you and I were in government together, who'd been in at the Quai d'Orsay and the Ministry of Defense, and sort of influential think tanks. It was a joy to go out with them. A lot of very high quality food, animated talk, fond references to you, but like I said, you missed it.
Yeah, I know. I'm wearing green because I'm green with jealousy that I missed it.
It really, I just, for the benefit of our listeners, I just want to say, one of the things that people don't really believe is that by the end of the Bush administration, the relationship with France was quite good on a whole bunch of strategic issues. And I will say that really owes an enormous amount to you, Eric. People may not know that you are a member of the Légion d'honneur, but by golly, you are. And you earned it. I mean, really, as an apprentice diplomat, I learned a lot by watching you interact with our colleagues who were great fun and still are great fun. And, they started as counterparts. They ended up as colleagues and friends. And that really is something I treasure. The break, end of December, January was terrific. Among other things, one of the highlights was watching Home Alone Part 2 with my grandchildren. And I think it's a movie that speaks to some of the larger issues of our time. I'll just leave it at that.
Because of the cameo appearance by the former and soon to be again president of the United States. I had a great break. Trish and I went to the Sidney Harman Hall at the Shakespeare Theater Company and saw the Tom Stoppard play Leopoldstadt, which was very interesting. And I finally watched Oppenheimer. It took me a couple of nights to get through it, but Trish and I did watch it. And I'm glad I waited, actually, and not, when it came out a couple of summers ago and was, the big movie of the summer. I'm glad I gave it, some time, because I had a lot of criticisms about it. And if I'd seen it in the theater, I would have absolutely ruined the cinematic experience for my wife, as I've done on other occasions.
I thought it was a great movie. It's not great history.
Yeah.
Because he really was a communist sympathizer, if not indeed a communist.
Yeah. I think it's pretty well established. I actually kind of went back and looked at some source material after watching it, because I had the same reaction that you just did. I thought it was a less great movie, actually, for a couple of reasons. One is that, I know a lot about the relationships among the physicists who were there, involved in this project. And yet, I think if you didn't have a scorecard, you would have had trouble because of the way Christopher Nolan jumps, around as he tells the story. So, I had that kind of, and my wife did as well, criticism of it cinematically. I think, Cillian Murphy as Oppenheimer is phenomenal. He's a phenomenal actor. and did a great job capturing, I think, Oppenheimer's kind of blend of arrogance and casualness about dealing with other people. I mean, a lot of things about Oppenheimer, but going back, even a revisionist historian like Barton Bernstein, who has done a lot about the early nuclear age and the development of the bomb and its uses politically, et cetera, has written in criticism of the Pulitzer Prize winning biography on which the movie is based, that the evidence, particularly the evidence came out of Soviet files, after the end of the Cold War, is he pretty clearly was a secret member of the Communist Party. Now, was the process that the AEC used to strip him of his clearance a fair process? No, clearly it wasn't. Was he an actual security threat at that point? Was he a spy? He probably was not a spy, but he was a communist, and he lied
And he lied
repeatedly
about it.
about it, repeatedly about it when he had opportunities to come clean and make a clean breast of it, and didn't. And so in the atmosphere of, the Rosenbergs and the Soviet detonation of an atomic bomb before anybody thought they would, and then a hydrogen bomb shortly after we did, taking away his security clearance, which is not a right, by the way, that anybody has.
Right. And they sort of demonized,
Borden and Teller, and
yeah, I mean, which I thought was excessive. I don't know if you find it this way. I actually, we don't go to movie theaters very much at all because I find it's a lot easier to watch the movie at home so that you're not seething there and saying, I'm paying 25 or more dollars a ticket to watch this. You can be a little bit more dispassionate.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's
One
always,
thing I think we probably to begin getting to business, we both want to acknowledge is we're taping this on January 6th. And of course, 4 years ago, there was an assault on the Capitol. People were killed. I think 140 police officers badly injured. It was instigated by the then President of the United States. And I think it behooves everybody to remember it and think about it, honor those who kind of did their best to protect Congress in the discharge of their duties. Note those who behaved in despicable fashions, and not forget it.
yeah. Well, I agree, in the sort of, in the spirit of, laughter and forgetting. Um, One of the things that's very troubling, and since we deal with history, both contemporary and some more remote history on this podcast, I have to say that the effort to rewrite history, which has been somewhat successful by President Trump and a lot of his allies, is very, very troubling. And it raises a lot of questions, particularly in an era where social media is dominant, when history enrollments around the country are dropping for a lot of reasons that we've talked about from time to time on this podcast. And I was just looking at something that was talking about the catastrophic decline of enrollment in history PhD programs, which is even more dramatic, I think, than the drop in undergraduate enrollments. I worry a lot that we're becoming a kind of amnesiac culture, and there is a great, to my mind, great danger in that.
Yeah. Well, here on Children of the Republic, we do our little bit, but the truth is, um, and actually, I'm going to be writing a piece about this shortly in the Atlantic. Once I've got it out, I'll be curious to hear your opinion of it. Um, there's a saying that's attributed to Solzhenitsyn. It's not clear whether or not he actually said it. Let lies come into the world, let them even triumph, but not through me. And that's the creed of a genuine intellectual, and I think it does make it particularly important for those of us who are not in a position to exercise power and never will be or never will be again, to be really resolute about uh, speaking the truth and fighting for it. And it's going to be real. It's always important. It'll be particularly important, I think, over the next 4 years and more.
Yeah, I mean, over the last several weeks, Congressman Barry Loudermilk, who some may recall was leading a group of people who may or may not have then participated in the insurrection the next day on a tour of the Capitol the day before the violence, released a report of the Government Oversight Committee of the House assaulting, our friend and former guest on our show, Liz Cheney, for her role in the January 6th committee. The Democrats, I noticed the other day, put out a response, a very detailed response that I think kind of sets the record straight. But I think historians are going to have their work cut out for them to draw on the voluminous material of the January 6th committee and its very lengthy report to make sure that the record is clear about what happened and not let Donald Trump and his administration memory hole it.
Yeah, yeah, I agree, but I think there's a broader way in which we live in a time where it's particularly important to speak out truths, including when they're uncomfortable. I mean, that's always the case, and unfortunately, it's not just the president-elect and his followers who have been going around saying things which are fundamentally not true, and need to hold the rest of them to account. So why don't we move on to the our main topic, which is international politics. I was wondering if I could ask you. So we're going to be at the beginning of a new presidential term. What do you think are the big things that are going to be out there for the second Trump administration in the field of foreign affairs and national security? Both the things that we can all see and foresee, but maybe some of the other things that might be a little bit harder to discern. Why don't you take your swing at that one?
So first, I think really important to note that it is pretty striking that the first Trump term was one in which the president really never faced, until COVID, a major foreign policy crisis. And COVID was, had a foreign policy element, of course, because of its origins in China, but it mainly was a public health crisis. But he did not have, the kind of galvanizing, crisis in international affairs that other presidents have experienced. It was rather, relatively speaking, the international environment's never, benign. And you certainly had the counter ISIL campaign going on, which his administration actually finished up under Jim Mattis. Although the general strategy had been set by the late Ash Carter in the late Obama administration. There still was low-level warfare going on in the Donbass, but the Ukraine war was, I want to say in remission, but it was sort of going through the Minsk diplomatic process. There was sort of battlefield stasis, I would say. So he had a relatively benign environment. That's not the environment he is, going to inherit. He's got, the largest land war in Europe going on. And Ukraine obviously will be very high on the agenda. He's appointed Keith Kellogg to be his envoy for Ukraine. And there he's going to, I think, be tested by the fact that, the Ukrainians are, I would say, not in a great position. I don't think their battlefield position is quite as dire as some suggest, but it's dire enough. At the same time, the Russians are in, not very good shape, and with some adroitly applied pressure, could maybe be brought to the table to negotiate, but and not without, some actual pressure being applied. So that's obviously going to be high up there. I think actually there'll be something higher on the agenda on day one, and you're beginning to see discussion of that in the press. There was an article by David Sanger in the New York Times while we were on break, and one in the Free Press by Jay Solomon just the other day, that there's a roiling debate inside the Trump transition about how to deal with Iran. And that's because Iran is in dramatically weaker position than it was when he was president the first time around, but also has been moving with greater alacrity in a direction of developing a nuclear capability. And he may be put to the test in the sense that, multiple presidents, including President Trump, when he was in office, said that they wouldn't allow Iran to become a nuclear power. He may now have to put up or shut up when it comes to that. So that will be on the agenda. Relatedly, Syria will be, on the agenda because we still have about 2,000 special forces folk in Syria keeping overwatch on ISIS, and in particular working with our Kurdish colleagues who actually control a number of prisons and detention camps where ISIS fighters who've been taken off the battlefield and their families are being held. Trump, famously said in his first term he wanted out of Syria, tried to get out of Syria a couple of times. One of those times led to the resignation of Jim Mattis. I think his instinct, based on his social media messages on Truth Social over the break, or, Syria is not our business. He may want to get out of there. If he does, that could be very destabilizing.
Yeah. But by the way, if I could just interrupt you for a moment on that one. I think, of course, he has certain proclivities which are very clear. But I think, in every administration, including his, runs into the fact that all of a sudden the world throws you something and you can't do what you want to do. So one thing I would just point out on the ISIS front, after a terrorist attack in New Orleans that killed 10 people with a guy waving an ISIS flag, so what happens if you're the president who says we're going to get out of Syria and stop the ISIS campaign? And I think when you know that the Democrats will be all over you the instant that you do that. So my guess is, that'll be one case where he goes, well, maybe I'll deal with that one later. And I think there'll be a whole bunch of things like that. I mean, you and I have talked about this before. On Russia, Ukraine, I'm sure he would like to kind of impose some sort of solution. But the Russians have, Putin in particular, really been sticking him in the eye. I mean, starting with those, I keep on going back to the fact that they decided to put on their national TV these nude pictures of Melania. And you think, what is that? Why would you do something that kind of insulting to an incoming president? And I think it's partly because they're unhinged. And Putin is sort of unhinged, and he is not reading the situation very clearly. And, his statements, which are completely uncompromising, are unhinged. So I can imagine this administration saying, okay, we're going to have to do something to bring them to their senses.
Yeah, I could easily imagine that. We'll see. I mean, first of all, there are going to be differences, and they're already showing up, among the advisors. I totally agree with you. I fully expect Mike Waltz and Marco Rubio to make precisely the argument you just made. In light of what happened in New Orleans, you really don't want to do, anything precipitate in Syria. But how long that lasts, we'll see. I mean, how many phone calls from Erdogan where Erdogan says, I want you to abandon the SDF, the, Kurdish partners we have in Syria, before he actually says, okay, I'm going to do it, because, Erdogan is one of the strong men with whom he has a, big bromance. So we'll see. The other thing that's out there kind of immediately, I think, is going to be this intensifying campaign of hybrid warfare that both Russia and China have been
together
pursuing. Yeah, together, independently, cutting cables, whether it's electric or gas pipelines, or electric or fiber optic cables, dragging anchors in the Baltic. Chinese just did cut a cable off Taiwan. This in sort of escalation of war in the gray zone is going to be, I think a problem and an issue that he's going to have to wrestle with. His national defense strategy in 2018 and national security strategy, suggested that we were in, intensifying strategic competition with Russia, China, some other countries, but mostly Russia and China being the most important one. I mean, truth is, increasingly, we're not just, in competition, but we're in these gray zone areas, whether it's in the information space, cyber, or, undersea covert things that they're doing. We're really in conflict every day, not just competition. So I think, those are some of the big things. And then, as you say, there are going to be any, number of things that are going to happen around the world that are going to be, black swans that we, don't anticipate now, but are going to, impose themselves on him, like the collapse of the Assad regime in Syria. Most people didn't see that coming. There'll be things like that that he'll have to deal with.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I think, one thing is it's not just unexpected things happening, it's other people deciding to do things. So, one thing with the Russians, which there was just a piece, I don't know if that was may have been in the Times. The Russians might make a grab for one of the smaller islands in the Baltic. They've been sniffing around the Faroes, which have a kind of an odd sort of status. As you know better than I, there are a lot of our Nordic allies, particularly the Finns and the Swedes, are really very concerned about this, as actually all of the Nordic states are. So there's that. I think there are two other things that I would put on the table. You didn't mention China, but China's clearly going through I don't know whether it's a crisis, but there is clearly some deep economic troubles, which the Chinese government doesn't know how to handle. At the same time, you've had this massive military buildup with an aging leader. So the chances we could wake up someday and the Chinese deciding to get very aggressive around Taiwan, and they've been getting more and more aggressive, of course, is out there. I'd mentioned two other things. You talked about we've talked about nuclear weapons before. I think there is a not insignificant chance that this administration, at some point, maybe not in the first year, but is going to find itself dealing with events that will trigger a nuclear proliferation cascade. Now, I know there are plenty of people who think, well, no, that's not all that probable for a whole bunch of reasons, but I don't really believe that. And I think it's one of the reasons why the Iranian case is so important. If the Iranians get nuclear weapons, there are a whole bunch of nuclear programs, I think, that end up being launched that are probably already there covertly. The other thing, and this is...
I agree with that, by the way.
And I'd like to, you spend more time on nuclear issues than I do, so I'd like to hear more from you on that. But the other thing that I find myself thinking about is we're clearly in the middle of some transitional period in the kind of Western liberal social democracies that are out there. And, it's taken some forms in our politics which are pernicious, some which are not so pernicious. I mean, there's a very interesting piece by Fareed Zakaria about, well, look, let's talk about the difference between New York and Florida. And let's look at the different, those big city outcomes, which are basically what he's doing. Is not just saying, well, there's a problem with the Dems. He's saying that there's a problem in some ways with a certain kind of progressive model of governance. As you and I are taping this, the Justin Trudeau has just resigned as prime minister in Canada. He will not be missed, at least by me. The Labour government in Britain is in deep trouble. They're more disturbing. You have the rise of AfD, the German right. Austria, you're getting what might be quite a hard right. I'm not even sure whether right is the correct word, but sort of a hard nationalist, pro-Russian government, which can form a bloc with Hungary and Slovakia. But I just have this, of course, France in the middle of a long, slow running political crisis of a similar kind. Now, I guess I don't see this as the decline of the West. But I see it as a particular kind of crisis of modernity, where the social democratic models, which basically emerged out of out of the end of World War II and the immediate post-war period, have kind of run their course, and it's why people like Elon Musk have this kind of disproportionate star power, and it's partly because he's so incredibly wealthy and has presided over companies which have done extraordinary things. You have to give them the due on that, but I think it's also because people are willing to listen to people like that and to perhaps to follow them in doing things. So, I think we're going to be living through a very turbulent time. So, some of the outcomes of which I will be in favor of, and others I'll be appalled by. So I don't know. I gave you a whole bunch of things there. So
let me start with the nuclear, and then I'll come to populism and nationalism and the mix among them or between them. So on the nuclear front, I agree with you that we may see the beginning of a nuclear cascade. I think I've talked about this recently, with Bill Kristol and others. President Kennedy famously had a press conference the spring before he died, in I think it was May of 1963, in which he was asked, what was the thing that kept him up at night most, and he basically said, and this of course is in the wake of the Cuban Missile Crisis. He said, I'm worried that by the end of the decade, by 1970, we could have 20 countries with nuclear weapons, and that will be a world that will be very difficult to manage. Now, in the event, 60 years later, we only have 9 nuclear powers. I mean, he knew when he was saying that China was on the cusp of, becoming the 5th nuclear power after the US, Russia, UK, France. So since he spoke, essentially, we've only had 4, additional, entrants into the nuclear weapons club: Israel, India, Pakistan, and North Korea.
South Africa too.
South Africa had a program, but then gave it up, and
they gave it up. But they have like 5 weapons.
They had a number of weapons, and it looks like they probably tested one over the South Atlantic at one point. But yes, they gave it up and gave up all the fissile material and et cetera. In fact, they set a standard that we should have used in the Iran nuclear agreement for coming clean about previous activities, which we did not, unfortunately. But part of that success was that the Soviet Union and then Russia, in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, shared an interest with us in keeping the number of nuclear powers limited, and that may be changing. Tony Blinken was just in South Korea and indicated that not only was Russia likely to be providing assistance to North Korea's space program, but that Russia might be getting ready to recognize North Korea as a nuclear power. That would be a big change from their traditional policy. And if that happens, and if Iran actually tests a nuclear weapon, becomes a nuclear power, I think it's unlikely that the non-proliferation treaty and the non-proliferation regime survive. I think you'll start to see other countries, Turkey for one. I think Erdogan's talked publicly about a nuclear weapons program at some point. Turkey certainly has the scientific knowledge to be able to do it. They've been building nuclear reactors. They are signatories to the NPT, but if the NPT goes away or they withdraw from it, you could see them moving that way. Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, God knows what kind of arrangements they had with AQ Khan in Pakistan. So there's plenty to be worried about on that score. And I think there are others who might also kind of become entrants into this marketplace. So you're quite right to be concerned about that.
I think in addition to the cases you've talked about, there's clearly discussions in Poland among certainly outside government, but I suspect inside as well. There's the South Koreans have been, until their latest political chaos, there were people talking about it. Even in Japan, there are people talking about it. So I think, there are a lot of people out there. And the other, of course, the other disruptive force in this one could very well be the president. I mean, he's perfectly capable of saying, well, why shouldn't the Poles have nuclear weapons? That would deal with the problem. I mean, it's one of the results of having somebody that disruptive in charge is that they could very well say some pretty crazy things. And, once you say that, it's very hard to unsay it.
What you just said, Eliot, is another way of saying that one of the strongest instruments of nonproliferation policy, although the arms control community does not always recognize it as such, has been U.S. security guarantees in the form of the NATO alliance for our European partners, a multilateral treaty, and the bilateral Article 5 guarantees that we give to the Republic of Korea and to Japan, the Philippines, and which we once upon a time gave to Taiwan when it was the Republic of China. And so, when those get called into question, inevitably it raises questions of self-help on the part of other governments that have been, reliant on us for their security for a very, very long period of time. So yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, on the populism question, I would add to what you said that, Robert Fico, just the Prime Minister of Slovakia, just went off on his own to Moscow to meet with Putin. I mean, you noted that, Austria could become a kind of little block with Hungary and Slovakia. Of course, Austria is not a NATO member, but Slovakia is, as is Hungary. So, look, you're right. I think there are a lot of things that go into this rise of populism. One has been a growth in global mobility and immigration, which has clearly created, a number of cultural issues. It's certainly true here. It's true in Canada. I mean, one of the reasons why Justin Trudeau is, just resigned is because he became incredibly unpopular, in part because of, flogging immigration as a solution to some of Canada's economic problems. Brexit clearly was driven to some degree by freedom of movement inside Europe and immigration into the United Kingdom. You see it certainly in Hungary and elsewhere. That's one thing. I think, you're right that the kind of collapse of the social democratic parties and their model of governance and the sense that government can accomplish things for average citizens is a big factor here. And I would add one other, which is, I think, less acknowledged, but I think has been very much a part of some of the research that Pippa Norris at Harvard, who, along with Ronald Inglehart, has done a lot on this whole question of global populism, which is the global movement of women into the workforce and sort of displacing men. You see it here, you see it elsewhere. It's clearly had a role in this as well. Hence, this sort of, this cult of masculinity that tends to go into these populist movements, I think is very much a part of this as well. So yes, I think we're in very turbulent political times here at home, but it's a global phenomenon.
It really is. I think as we've discussed, I was in London immediately after Brexit, and the thing that really hit me being there at that time for a few days was the extent to which this was a reaction against the elites, including the financial elites. This was not the peasants rising up against the aristocrats. This was something different. But it was definitely a kind of revulsion against the elites. That is very much how I interpret a lot of what happened here in the 2024 elections. That elite ideologies, a lot of stuff gets put under the pejorative word woke, but a lot of the DEI and a whole basket of things, which are where you have a whole bunch of elite opinions in a variety of ways, which a large number of people find baffling or offensive, something like that. So I think that's part of what's happened is that the elites that have run most of our countries, for better or for worse, over a long period of time, have been discredited. So that's one issue. Another issue, and this is very sensitive, and I want to try to frame it as carefully as possible. After the Iraq War and after Trump running on the idea of a Muslim ban, nobody talked about issues really having to do with fundamentalist Islam. Besides, ISIS had been sort of contained, defeated in many ways, at least for a time in Iraq. So people didn't want to talk about it. But it's just abundantly clear, I think, that not really in the United States, actually, but in a lot of European countries, the issue is not just immigration. It's, what kind of immigrants and to what extent can people truly assimilate and kind of buy off on the values of the society. And that drives a lot of it in France. It drives a lot of it in Germany, in Eastern
UK.
Europe, and in Canada, by the way.
Right.
And so those are, and this, you got to be, and you want to be careful about all this, but this could really resurface in some quite ugly ways. That's part of, I think, the story right now of the Labour Party, and particularly Prime Minister Keir Starmer in Britain. And you and I were going to talk a bit about Elon Musk, and we should, and maybe use this as an opening. So Elon Musk tears into Keir Starmer. Part of what he tears into him about is this enormous scandal that they had, where there were gangs mainly of Pakistani and Bangladeshi men who were grooming young women, and some of whom were barely teenagers, and exploiting them sexually and violence. And this was really large scale. And what's happening, if you follow the British press, this is finally erupting out in the surface. At the time, there were some prosecutions and so forth. But it's clear that a lot of it was kind of swept under the rug, or you don't discuss it. And that's in part because of the electoral consequences for Labour if you do. But it's also, a certain kind of British political correctness about these things. And that stuff is seething. And I mean, I've been fascinated to read some of the British newspapers recently about this, the extent to which, by the virtue of Elon Musk throwing one verbal bombshell, or I guess a tweet, all of a sudden this thing is erupting.
Not just one tweet, but a steady stream of tweets for several days. I mean, but look, here's the thing. Yes, this is a real issue, and obviously the Brits are now in the throes of wrestling with it. This is not purely a Keir Starmer. I got plenty of criticisms of Keir Starmer and of the Labour government, which I think has made a mess of things since it took over in July.
It's a Conservative problem too.
But it's a Tory problem too. And it's not just a Tory problem. Some of the people that Elon Musk is touting, Tommy Robinson being, chief among them, are even too extreme for Nigel Farage. So now Elon Musk is calling, after saying that the Reform Party was the only party that could save Britain, he's now saying that, Nigel Farage isn't, doesn't have the stuff to be the leader of the Reform Party and save Britain. And he's now, today I saw that he was tweeting, we should liberate Britain from its tyrannical government. I mean, he might be the proverbial broken clock who is right about something twice a day, but he manages to mangle so much of this in going after it, that it raises a question about his larger role here, because it's not just Britain. It's saying that the AFD, which, I'm sorry, with all due respect to the vice president elect, is an extremist party that has lots of neo Nazis in it. Um, you know, the the general kind of right wing uh, sort of lunacy that Musk is kind of trying to propound. It is unprecedented, I think, that we have the richest man in the world as a presidential advisor with no accountability. He's not accountable because he's not a government official. He won't be accountable to the United States Senate or to the House. Yet he can throw a spanner into the works, about this. It's fine for him to, raise this question, of what happened in the UK with these young women who, clearly were terribly mistreated by these gangs. Obviously, that needs to be, examined. But Keir Starmer is going to come and meet with Donald Trump. Is Elon Musk going to be in the room? How's that going to go? I mean, there is a lot here that I think we have not, we don't understand what this means because we've never faced anything like this before.
Yeah, so in some ways, I find the phenomenon fascinating, and I ask myself, first the man himself. So he's clearly a brilliant businessman. You can say how much of it is marketing, and a talented engineer. I mean, SpaceX, that's amazing. Tesla, in its own way, is amazing. So you have to give him credit for that. But who is clearly emotionally extraordinarily immature, and who apparently can't get a security clearance because of some of the stuff he ingests.
And the contact he's had that he hasn't reported.
Yeah, and he says he takes ketamines for depression and all that. Who goes around fathering lots of children, not giving them names which are going to burden them for the rest of their lives. I mean, maybe they'll have huge trust funds, but you really want your kid to go through life with a very bizarre name. It's but there's something clearly that about him that has seized the imagination of a lot of other people, and that actually is what I find interesting. So what is it about some of these kind of tech types that all of a sudden has an awful lot of people paying attention to them and taking them seriously? I mean, we've had enormously wealthy people who have thrown a lot of money at dubious or terrible causes. I mean, Henry Ford. I mean, very wealthy, tremendous businessman. I mean, he gave us the Model T and mass production and all that. Disgusting anti-Semite. Okay, but this is something a little bit different, I think. And again, it seems to me it goes to the nature of our society somehow, that a guy like this, who is in the non-business parts of his life, I don't know whether you want to say dysfunctional, but so far out of the norms of what you would want in a kind of normal civilized society, you got to ask, well, why is he landing the way he is with so many people?
Well, he's got 200 million followers on Twitter, or X, which is one thing. I mean, given how much time he spends on social media. You really wonder how much is he really managing SpaceX, Tesla, the Boring Company, Neuralink, XAI. I mean, you know, I think that's an open question. Now, I mean, you got to give him credit because he's hired some people, who've done some amazing things at these places, and particularly SpaceX. I think is really impressive. Some of these other companies, the Boring Company, I mean, have they really done anything yet with the Hyperloop? I TBD. We'll see. Neuralink, I don't know. Maybe that I know they've implanted one chip in somebody's brain, and that.
But I mean, there are other people doing that, by the way. I mean, I once visited the applied physics lab at Johns Hopkins when I was dean, and it was pretty amazing. They were showing me somebody virtually flying an airplane, just with their things implanted in their head, which was.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, he's clearly captured people's imagination, and people think he's a guru, and he thinks he's a guru. I mean, he now thinks he's an expert on everything, when in fact, on social media, he's become one of the single biggest disseminators of, misinformation, disinformation, et cetera. And although he, styles himself as a free speech absolutist,
No, he's not.
it's
He's
pretty
clearly
clear
not.
he's clearly not.
Yeah, but I mean, don't you think he's going to crash and burn? I mean, among other things, sooner
God,
or
I hope
later,
so.
I can't imagine him and Trump continuing this relationship indefinitely. I mean, that it would be completely out of keeping with Trump's previous record, I think.
Yeah, and it's kind of creepy, actually. I mean, to the way he's moved into Mar-a-Lago, and kind of tried to insert himself into Trump's family. I don't know. We'll see. I mean, the problem is that I think under normal circumstances, what you say about Trump and Musk, coexisting, I think would be correct. But because he is the richest man in the world, because he pumped $250 million into Trump's reelection campaign, and arguably, I don't know how much of a difference he made or didn't make, but certainly Trump feels some sense of obligation to him, um, because he's put him in charge of this high-profile effort to streamline the government and create greater efficiency. And because Trump just worships money and thinks that's the real marker of success and intelligence, I think he may have more staying power, than and he's connected to a bunch of other tech bros who are now kind of insinuated into the Trump administration in a variety of ways, whether it's Peter Thiel or David Sachs or others. So and there's going to be influence there through Vance, who's a creature of Peter Thiel's. So this is, I think, a longer term phenomenon, and particularly with the tax bill coming, which is going to be a huge windfall for these guys. Uh, the the one thing that I think might change all this is actually the fight that broke out between Musk and Bannon and
Yeah,
company over
I was
over.
about to ask you about that. I mean, it's as a good Marxist, I'm sure you're always looking, or good Leninist, you're always looking for the internal contradictions, comrade. So, can you give us a dialectical analysis of this?
Well, that's a contradiction because the debate that has broken out about the H-1B visas, which the tech guys really want, but the MAGA true believers see as just another way to let more brown and colored people into the United States, which they don't want. that's really going to be I think a big fight inside MAGA world. I mean, my own view of this is that immigration policy should be regarded as a strategic comparative advantage for the United States, and we ought to try and use it to that effect. H-1B visas are a part of that. I'm all in favor of us creating brain drain from Iran and getting Iran's best minds to come here so that their government collapses and that we get the benefit of smart people. But that does require that we actually control the border, and not just allow anybody into the country, and that we not allow unfettered immigration, which does lower wages and create competition. I mean, we need immigration, that's clear. We've got a labor shortage right now in this country, but it needs to be done in a regulated way, not least because it does tend to elicit these kinds of political backlashes that we've just been talking about, not only here but around the world.
See, I think I agree. I think this is just the first example of what will be a number of other internal contradictions in the administration. One, just starting with the fact that you have these tremendously wealthy people who are going to make out like bandits with taxes. And while on the one hand, Americans tend to sort of admire people who make vast amounts of money and kind of cheer them on, there's also a certain point where they don't like plutocrats. And there is a notion of malefactors of great wealth.
Right.
And that will, particularly when people lower down the chain, really begin to feel it. So I think that'll be, that's going to be another contradiction that will come to bite them. But there'll be others. There'll be,
particularly when they start, trying to find offsets to these tax cuts that start imposing cuts on things like Medicare, Medicaid, other very popular programs that Trump promised he wouldn't touch. I think that's going to be a big source of tension.
Well, and then the defense. At some point they'll probably try to take an axe to defense as well, and then the defense hawks in the party will get exercised by it. There'll be tensions over China. I think Trump will want to make a deal somehow, but there'll be plenty of people who are unhappy with it. So I actually, the way I think this is going to work is you're going to have a whole bunch of people who will be competing with one another. I mean, it'll be a more disciplined White House because I just think Susie Wiles is probably the most effective chief of staff he's ever had. But they will still, just because she can clearly manage him better and kind of keep a rein on things. But I just think that they'll be consumed with fight. They'll fight over abortion, for example. That'll be some kind of issue.
There are going to be lots of fights. I mean, I don't. Look, Susie Wiles is a very able political, operative. I don't think she's ever done anything like this before, though, in the policy realm. And so, she'll have a very steep, I think, learning curve. And then the question will be, can she survive in that kind of atmosphere, which is orders of magnitude, I think, different than the stresses and strains of a political campaign.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. As you indicated at the beginning of this podcast, I mean, most administrations face an asteroid kind of hurtling in from outer space, blowing stuff up. For the Bush administration, obviously, it was 9/11, which is completely reoriented. Now, I mean, the essence of unpredictable events is that they're unpredictable. But let me ask you to speculate on what do you think are the most plausible policy asteroids that could come hurtling in on this administration?
obviously, something on the Korean Peninsula, something, in the Taiwan Strait, actually, something between Japan and China in the East China Sea, which, people are focused very much on Taiwan and the South China Sea, but, you could easily have something in the Senkakus that, blows up. It's as you say, it's the nature of black swans that we don't see them coming, as opposed to the gray rhinos that we know are charging down at us like government debt, things like that. So, it could be almost anything. It could be a regime that collapses somewhere. I mean, it could be the North Korean regime that collapses. Who knows? I mean, it could come from almost any direction. There's one thing we started on this topic a couple of weeks ago, which was the inevitable tendency of administrations to try and shape and polish their legacy, on the way out after the election is over. And we've already both, I think, commented that, this is a vain endeavor, that, no matter how many speeches or interviews they give, whether it's Tony Blinken or Jake Sullivan or the president himself, it will be historians ultimately who judge, and these interviews, won't really have that much impact in shaping things. It will be people going back through the key decisions and the documents when they become available, et cetera. But I've been really struck that this group has been working overtime to try and, polish the legacy as they go out the door. I mean, the latest example was Tony Blinken's interview with Lulu Garcia Navarro of the New York Times, in which she kind of presses him, I think, in a very unfair way about Israel and Gaza. And he actually delivers himself of a, I thought, pretty thoughtful comment about, well, where the hell is the international community? Where's the New York Times been about just telling Hamas to knock it off, give the hostages back, and stop all this? Hamas has had it within its power to end all this anytime it wanted to. And they've never done it, which I think reflects a lot of frustration he and others have had as they've tried to work out this final hostage deal that seems to be continuing to elude them.
Yeah, I got an invitation over the weekend. I think you may have gotten one as well, to attend a meeting at the NSC to get briefed on, I think, on the wonderful things they've done. And I didn't respond, but if I had responded, I would have said, after 4 years, it's a bit bloody late. I mean, you've had my email address for quite some time. If you'd wanted to invite me in for a chat, I would have been happy to come. But the idea that I'm really going to come and be sold on the administration in its last couple of weeks is bizarre. And again, what I find interesting about this is more in a way like the discussion we just had about Musk. So how could otherwise highly intelligent people think that they can really shape other people's perception of them at this stage, particularly people who have not been hugely sympathetic to them thus far? And I think it goes to something quite deep, which I've become more and more convinced of the longer I live in Washington and have my own experiences there, which is that there are all kinds of ways in which power deranges you, and it causes you to lose some very basic qualities of judgment and proportion. And it's why it's a very good thing that people get thrown out of office after 4 years or maybe 8 years at the outside. And it's why it's worrisome when you're dealing, as we are now, with dictators who've been in power for a lot longer than that, and in settings where they get much less in the way of pushback than any American president is going to get. I mean, you become more and more detached from reality. That's part of the price you pay for power. And this is a small, almost humorous example of it because as you say, they can't shape the narrative in the slightest. It's going to be the people writing in the decades to come. but there's a lesson in it.
Yeah, I mean, I declined. I mean, I actually had a conflict anyway, but I declined on more or less the same grounds. That you've had Sam Charup in to visit you like 100 times to talk about Ukraine, and now you want to talk to me as you're walking out the door. No thanks. I've got better things to do in my time. Um, Look, I agree. I mean, um, it is very easy to get wrapped up in government inside your own bubble, and it's very easy to spend all your time drinking your own bathwater, which is what all too many folks end up doing in government. Um, and I'm not sure what the antidote is. I mean,
No, the antidote is that people get that people have to leave. And look, I think you can understand the human dynamic. As you and I both know, you really throw yourself into these jobs. They're lots of 14, 16-hour days, lots of lost weekends, lots of time that you don't have with family, lots of very high stress situations, and where you feel you've been pouring it all out for the country, and you're desperate for people to recognize that, but you're also desperate to convince yourself that this was all in the name of major achievements, and to face the possibility that maybe actually we didn't accomplish all that much. Boy, that's tough.
well, and also, look, you're subject to enormous cross pressures in those jobs, and you know them better than anybody on the outside does. And look, to be fair, it's easy for us to sit here and criticize and to say they should have done this, they should have done that. Part of the problem is that um, because you know all the cross pressures, you tend to think your decisions were overdetermined and that you could not really have done anything different than what you did. And then you become, anxious to persuade everybody else that, you could not have done anything other than what you did. And in Washington, there are all too many journalists who are willing to sit there and be a scribe and take down what you say and then say, oh, well, these people are really brilliant. And look, this is the whole, going back to David Halberstam's book, The Best and the Brightest, this is a classic trope of Washington.
Yeah. It's also, I think, I mean, a lot of it's very easy in those positions, I think, particularly towards the end, to come away with a lot of self pity, and a lot of feeling that the criticism is unfair. If you only knew, and all that, and it's. I think it takes a sort of a large personality just to shrug that off and say, look, I gave it my best. I have no idea how this will turn out. I mean, I think the healthy attitude is that the public service is its own reward. That having done your best, no matter how it turns out, that's all you can ask for. And you've been privileged to be put in one of those positions, and let other people can argue about it. And you may have been wrong, but at least you gave it your best. And I think that's the only sane consolation people should take.
Yeah, and interestingly, if you think back, um, well, with Jimmy Carter's passing now to our current former presidents, and there are not that many of them now. Bush 43 has very much been that way. I mean, one might have wished that he spoke out a little bit more on things like January 6th and whatnot, and Trump maybe he should have endorsed Kamala Harris or whatever. But I think in terms of his attitude towards his own presidency, it's been very much let historians judge. I mean, I know he's met with at least one historian who's written somewhat critically, but also fairly about some of the decisions he made, and he seemed to be quite, you know, he took the criticism with equanimity, I think is the best way to put it.
Yeah, no, that doesn't surprise me. I mean, I think that is the kind of guy he was. It's very unusual. I mean,
Yeah,
let's say it's not the way Nixon. Well, I mean, Reagan, of course, Reagan was losing it at the end. Nixon certainly was not. Nixon was determined to rehabilitate his reputation, understandably.
yeah, but I think Clinton and Obama, who are the other living ex presidents, both I think are still um, quite involved in sort of managing their quote legacy
Oh yeah,
unquote.
Obama in particular, I think.
And Trump, of course, as well. I mean, in his own way, I mean, has been the curator of his own legacy, which is sort of where we started the show. His ability to rewrite the history of January 6th, which is astonishing, really. He's had a lot of amanuenses to do that, but um, hopefully historians will get the story right.
Well, all I can say is we at Shield of the Republic will be fearless and forthright in holding them all to account. So they've been forewarned.
All right. Elliot, good to see you. I look forward to seeing you next week.
Yep, same here. Take care.